Hey y'all, Eric Estep here. I want to welcome you all to the audiobook edition of The Legend of Groovy Hollow. The annual Groovy Hollow iRacing event is all about supporting Extra Life, a Children's Miracle Network Hospitals program. So to thank you all for your generous support over the years, we bring you The Legend of Groovy Hollow, a novel written by Cody Williams and performed by Jillian Cool. In the first episode, we'll meet our cast of characters as they uncover the history of Groovy Hollow Raceway and hear the first rumblings of the ominous Halloween machine and its mysterious wheelman. Let's head to the sleepy town of Commonwealth and meet up with the Swanson family.
Prologue. Jerry Slater was standing on the corner of Hickory and Elm when he heard the revving of an engine roll out of the crawling mist off in the distance. Initially, he dismissed the sound as a trick of the ear, a mean prank his mind was playing on him as he waited for his connection in Whisperwood to arrive so they could make the exchange. Still, he immediately thought of the Groovy Hollow racetrack located in the woods, and his skin began to crawl and his pulse quickened. Growing up there, he had heard the stories of the Groovy Hollow Raceway all his life. And though he didn't believe in ghosts, there was some element of truth to the story. A real-life occurrence. Maybe a tragedy, maybe not. That made it all too real to outright ignore. It was just a campfire story, he would tell himself, and that would make him feel a little better, for a little while. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone to check the time. It was nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. Christ, where was the kid? He was due there to make the exchange almost an hour ago. Looking at his phone now, he hadn't received any messages or calls to explain the unusual delay. Maybe something came up. He rationalized and told himself that he would give it 10 more minutes before he packed it up and headed home. A noticeable biting chill was in the air, and Jerry pulled his jacket tighter. He glanced back at his phone. In the upper right corner of the screen read the words, "No service." Great. Just great. Jerry had lived virtually his entire life in the small town of Commonwealth, and he knew as well as anybody that there were only 3 ways out of the poverty-riddled streets of his hometown. Racing at the local short tracks every weekend, just barely making enough to cover all the bills. The drug operation headquartered out of Whisperwood and the neighboring Biltmore, and, of course, the finality of death. Jerry had tried his hand at racing in the past. Despite Mama's protests, he was once determined to make something of himself, driving that used pastel-colored late-model stock with the number 33 plastered on the side over in Kingsport, at Hickory, and, of course, someday, the mythical Groovy Hollow Raceway. Mama had always detested this dream, telling him that one day he was going to crash, and it was going to be so bad that there ain't going to be no coming back from it. He dismissed it as common motherly naggings and continued to work on his race car week in and week out. However, the problem with trying to make a career in the local short track scene is that the purses were not big enough to cover all the weekly bills, let alone provide food for the table. Mama damn near broke her back cleaning houses over in Johnson City for some of the wealthiest members of the Tri-Cities community. To cover the expenses, he wasn't raking in on the late model circuit, as well as to make sure they're both fed and healthy. But Mama wasn't a spring chicken anymore, and whenever she was gone, Jerry knew that he'd be screwed. The second biggest issue with trying to make a career in the local racing scene is that if you only had one car, which Jerry and his mama did, they couldn't afford a second one. You best keep your nose clean week in and week out and ought not to get caught up in someone else's messes. The problem for Jerry, though, was that he wasn't just getting caught up in his messes. He caused a large bulk of them himself. Nasty crashes that, more often than not, had seen a driver or two get hurt. Luckily, there were no fatalities, not while he was racing. Still, there were enough injuries to make Jerry reconsider his mama's insistent protests, and he inevitably hung up his racing gear altogether. He sold the car to some old man in town. The man wasn't elderly or anything. He likely would have been around his mama's age, maybe a tad bit younger. But he was old enough for Jerry to wonder why he would be looking around to getting into racing at his age. Racing was a young man's game, especially at that level. and Jerry was nearing the threshold of aging out of it himself. Ultimately, he decided that it didn't matter. After all, the man's money was good, and it helped him and his mama out big time for a little while. But it didn't take long for the wolves to come back, howling at the door, and for the eviction notices to be hammered into the cheap wood of their front door. Jerry got a job working nights at the local laundromat, but the pay was middling at best. Mama took on more clients in the surrounding area and worked harder than she had ever worked in her life, even harder than just after Daddy died. Things changed when Mama fell at the Watson estate and had to take some time off work to have her surgery and to heal up. But the doctors weren't sheepish in letting him know that it was entirely possible that Mama would never work again. With her out of work indefinitely, Jerry needed to find something else. A side gig that paid handsomely so that he and his mama could continue just barely keeping up with the bullshit life had to throw at them. How Jerry connected to the buyer group in Whisperwood was a simple story. He knew a guy who knew a guy. Reggie introduced him to his contact and asked if he'd ever done glass. Jerry shook his head, not knowing what Reggie and the connection were discussing, but it didn't matter much. The arrangement was this. Once a week, the connection would deliver him a box at the most isolated corner of Commonwealth. Jerry wouldn't ask what was in the box and wouldn't care. The connection would then hand him a thick envelope full of cash. He'd shove it in his back pocket and take the package to the alley behind the post office. There, he would leave the package for some guy named Gus, if that was his real name. And he'd go home, counting the money on the kitchen table as Mama slept in the living room, the TV on and mindlessly playing one of those old black and white Universal Monsters films, as they did on the regular almost every Friday night. The amount of cash was never the same. Sometimes it was right at $550, while at other times it was well over $600. Still, for a weekly fee, that wasn't bad at all. Not to mention his other regular paycheck from Right Laundry and the compensation from whatever odd jobs he picked up around the community. Sometimes he mowed the grass, sometimes he'd clean a house just like his mama. There was always something he could be doing in Commonwealth, and with Mama laid up like she was, he had to do what he had to do. He checked his phone again. 8 minutes had passed. 2 more and he was getting the hell out of there. He fought the urge to count the minute down to the very last second, figuring that would only make the time pass agonizingly slower than just waiting it out. Off in the distance, he heard the sound of an engine again. But it wasn't just a common car engine. All its sound was choked out by a muffler. It was loud, echoing throughout the whole valley. Jerry thought of the speedway again. There was no way there was going to be a race run at this time of night or even a practice session. Local laws wouldn't stand for it. Disturbing the peace, Jerry thought with a scoff. Wasn't that the point of auto racing, to be loud and rowdy, thus disturbing the peace? When the Groovy Hollow Raceway was rediscovered a number of years ago, there was somewhat of a debate as to what the people of Commonwealth ought to do with it. There was a group of locals who advanced to demolish it, considering it something of an eyesore and a potential disturbance of their peace of mind. Jerry shook his head at the thought and laughed, happy that bunch of cockatoos didn't get their way. Not that they didn't try, and their efforts were fierce. Online petitions were created, social media accounts too. The hashtags #SaveTheSpeedway and #DemolishTheHollow began to spar on Twitter. Jerry Slater was a proud member of the former, he thought with a smirk, and fully delved into the online harassment side of things social media tends to inevitably encourage. Suppose he could make the day worse for just one of those smug SOBs wanting to tear it down. That made his day. Hell, that might have even made his whole damn week. Eventually, thankfully, the community won out. While in initial court hearings, the government admitted that they didn't quite know what they were going to do with the track. They also voted to deem Groovy Hollow Raceway as a historic landmark protected by state law. That was when the cash really started to flow in. With the legendary, infamous Groovy Hollow rediscovered, the state of Tennessee flooded Commonwealth with some dough, insistent that they fix it up and start hosting racing there again. And that was exactly what happened. It was largely a community effort to clean it up, make sure it was free of overgrowth, and ensure the grandstands were stable and safe. Only the protesters who argued that the speedway would disturb their lives held out on the project. Who needs 'em? Jerry thought with a scorn at the time. and still firmly held the sentiment to this day. If they don't love it, they can leave it. 1 minute to go by now, surely, maybe even less. The chill in the air was getting to Jerry a little bit. He could no longer feel his hands, and his toes seemed absurdly cold. "Screw this," he huffed, noting the fog of breath that escaped him. He thought it was a little early to get that cold, but he let it go. It was time to get the heck out of there. He'd text the connection and tell him the kid from that other town never showed. It wouldn't be a popular thing to tell him, but hey, it was what happened, and he was damn tired of waiting. Jerry tucked the package under his arm and started to walk home. The fog seemed eerily thick now, possessing the odd stink of sulfur. From behind, spilling out of a thickening mist, came the sound of a rumbling, unmuffled engine. Jerry stopped dead in his tracks. He rolled his eyes and cursed. If the Commonwealth police heard the sound of the car that was no doubt behind him, the owner would no doubt be ticketed. Jerry knew that firsthand. It happened to him on occasion back when he owned his own late model. He didn't miss those fines and fees, so at least that was a silver lining. He turned then, putting up a hand as he expected to be blinded by the bright golden twin beams of headlights. But everything behind him was dark. There was a single street lamp on the corner where he had previously stood, but everything else was swallowed up by complete darkness. Just beyond the reach of the lamp's glowing orb was the darkened outline of a car. It just sat there, idling loudly. Due to the shadows, Jerry couldn't quite make out its most distinctive features, but it was obviously a car, and a massive one at that, sitting taller than most cars in the Commonwealth community. "Hey!" Jerry called back. "Hey, pal!" Jerry always loathed the sound of his own voice, thinking it made him sound like some dumb redneck twanger. "You might want to shut that off, the engine. If the popo hears that thing, there'll be some real trouble for—" His words trailed off. The engine of the car revved loudly, and then it crept ever so slowly into the orb of light reflecting on the street. It was impossible. Simply couldn't be. Jerry recognized the car. A late model stock with a pinched Camaro front nose. It was splattered a black, orange, and white paint, and the hood read, "The Halloween Machine." Jerry's first thought at the realization was to assume that it was some sort of joke, like he was being punked or something. "Very funny," he called out. But nobody was laughing. Nobody made a sound. Jerry took a nervous step back, completely unaware that the box had slipped from under his arm and had fallen down, tumbling over into the street. The Halloween machine advanced, but took its time, moving at a mile, maybe only 2 miles per hour, crawling towards him. Hey, buddy!" The car stopped. "You got me, all right? You played your little joke. How about you shut that thing off and step out here, man to man?" Jerry squinted, trying to get a good look at the driver through the windshield. But with all the darkness inside the car and fog, he couldn't make out much of anything, save for a single shape behind the wheel that could have been anybody. There was a moment of dead silence, save for the rumbling engine of the car. Jerry waited for something, anything to happen. The suspense inside him wound tight like a chain around his neck. Then something did happen. The car lunged forward. The engine screamed, echoing throughout the valley, and the tires squalled. Smoke from both the exhaust and the rubbery tires mixed and mingled with the fog, and the whole area smelled like burnt rubber. Jerry turned and ran. He ran until it felt like his heart was going to give out and his legs were about to fall out from under him. But he didn't run long. He disappeared into the mist, the car close behind him. All sounds faded into nothing. Commonwealth was quiet and peaceful yet again. Chapter 1. Tommie Jo wanted to be a racer for as long as she could remember. It was an obsession that, like many fans of the sport, started with Matchbox cars. One of her earliest memories was watching the live-action adaptation of Scooby-Doo with her mom and dad. Mom had burnt the popcorn. She always burnt it. And she and her dad were making faces at one another, choking down the kernels as the added salt and sprayable butter did little to cover up its overly charred flavor. A short time after watching the movie, maybe a week later, Mom had taken her to Walmart. Tommie didn't want to go initially. Shopping, especially at that young age, was just so boring. But the bribe of getting a toy in return for accompanying her mother made her more than agreeable. The first toy aisle Mom took her down was the doll aisle. The shelves were full of Barbie and baby dolls, all standing stiffly in nauseating pink boxes. She has always hated the color pink. Purple she could get behind, but pink? After finding little of interest in the first aisle, Mom wheeled her down the aisle containing different kinds of card and board games. Mom looked intently for something that might tickle her daughter's fancy, bringing over various Uno cards, insisting to her that it was fun and that she would teach her. None of that did it for her. They went to the next aisle, and Mom stalled. "We don't want this aisle," Mom said and started to retreat. "No! This one, Mama, this one!" Tommie shouted. She pointed down at it, and Mama gave her a certain raised eyebrow look. "Really?" Tommie nodded eagerly. Mama nodded, shrugged, said, "Okay," and started to take her daughter down what she considered the boys' aisle. They pushed past the various sections of WWE, UFC, and Minecraft toys, stopping only when Tommie pointed and said, "That, Mama, I want that!" Mama stopped, pulled a packaged 1/64 scale car from the shelf, and handed it to her. "This one?" "Yes! Yes!" The car was a black and orange painted generic race car with Scooby-Doo advertised on the rear quarter panels. On one side of the car was Scooby's face, broad in a grin, his impossibly long tongue hanging out. On the back rear of the car was an orange lip. Later, she asked her dad what that was. That was when she learned it was a spoiler, but didn't understand its purpose. Shooting out from the car's hood was a big chrome V8 engine. Thus began Tommie's collection of 1/64 die-cast cars. This car led to an obsession with Hot Wheels and, once she was a little older, with NASCAR. She still had this car, sitting proudly on the shelf above her bed alongside various other NASCAR cars and figurines from classic horror movies from the 70s and 80s. She loved horror almost as much as she loved racing, and she believed there was a pretty good balance between horror memorabilia and NASCAR merch scattered throughout her room. Those were their two most valuable pastimes for her and her dad, watching NASCAR with her dad on Sunday afternoons becoming the earliest of her routines. The first race she had ever watched on TV, from initial green flag to checkered, was the 2014 Daytona 500. It was a long day, that race lasting late for her into the night, but with the help of a series of naps during a lengthy red flag postponement due to weather, she could stay awake to see the end. And what an ending it had. There he was, NASCAR's undisputed most popular driver, taking the checkered flag to win his second Daytona 500, snapping a long, nearly 2-year winless drought. Part of her fell in love with Dale Jr. that night, and she has been a firm member of Junior Nation ever since. What she remembered the most about the race was the caution right before the final 2-lap shootout to the end. In his white, blue, red, and gold number 88 Chevy, Earnhardt had picked up a piece of tape on the grill, putting his win into question. And the tape crew calling the race, whom she later realized was the NASCAR on Fox Dream Team of Darrell Waltrip, Mike Joy, and Larry McReynolds, albeit a little into the sunset of the peak, didn't miss on the opportunity to amp up the drama. They made it clear to the audience watching at home that overheating might now be an issue. Tommie looked at her dad then, and he looked back with a reassuring smile. He knew what she was thinking. Heck, he was probably feeling the doubts himself. "Don't worry," he said. "There's only 2 laps to go. He won't overheat in that amount of time. If anything, the tape might help him, might better the handling of his car." Tommie didn't know if the tape on the nose of Junebug's car made much of a difference, but it didn't matter. Dale Jr., the Pied Piper of Daytona, completed the 2 laps relatively unchallenged. After the checkered flag flew, one of the announcers, she thought it might have been Mike Joy, pointed out that a black number 3 had returned to Daytona that weekend. As he stated this fact, he lamented, "Wonder where that black piece of tape came from." It was impossible to know for sure, of course. Still, Tommie liked to imagine the ghost of the great late Dale Earnhardt peeling back some of the tape that was holding together Austin Dillon's wounded number 3 car and carefully placing it on Junior's grill to give his son the advantage. But that was more of a storybook ending than anything else. Since then, watching races with Dad has become a staple of their weekend plans. When Tommie turned 16 a couple of years ago, her father bought her a car. But the car was not street legal. She wouldn't be driving up and down the streets of Commonwealth taking it to school, or even to the movies on a Friday night. No, what Dad had purchased was a used Chevrolet late model stock car meant to race on the local short track circuit. Dad had gotten it from a local racer in town looking to move on from the business. Dad told her that he believed the poor little man just experienced too much heartbreak behind the wheel of the car, where he raced primarily at Kingsport Speedway, though he would occasionally make the trip to Hickory or even down to Florence. The plan initially was for the two of them to fix it up together, a father-daughter project of sorts. "I need a hobby," Dad had told her once while looking under the hood, surveying the work that needed to be done. He looked at her then, a gleam in his eye telling her he was so proud of his daddy's girl. "I figured you needed one too." He flashed her a wink. "When we're done," she asked him then, "fixing it up, I mean, what are we going to do with it? Sell it?" She said this, a marked disappointment sounding in her voice. Dad puckered out his lower lip and he rolled his eyes. "If you want to, I bet it could get you through college, or at least pay for some of it. Or, could we race it?" The grin on Daddy's face confirmed his true intentions of purchasing the car. Tommie ran over to him and gave him a big squeeze around the neck and a peck on the cheek. The car, which Tommie later named Amelia, was a fixer-upper. The man who owned it before, Jerry Slater, was pretty rough on his equipment, often crashing out and unable to turn much of a profit racing. Daddy said that he then turned his life to more questionable business dealings, but that it wasn't his place to judge. Jerry would eventually have to come to terms with all the wicked things he had done just to make a little bit of money. But Daddy's primary interest was getting the car up and running so that she, Tommie herself, could one day be turning laps over in Kingsport or at any of the other local short tracks in the area. The original number on the side was 62. Tommie didn't like it. She didn't think it fit her. "I want something with an 8 in it," she told her dad, "but I don't want it to be just 8 or 88. I don't want to copy Dale Jr., but it's important that there's an 8 in the number." Dad nodded but didn't say anything, probably thinking that number selection would be a more appropriate conversation once the car was ready to turn some actual laps on the track. The number they ultimately went with was 28 in big block font. In the year that followed Tommie's 16th birthday, she and Dad got the car running and moving. Dad even took a couple of laps around Kingsport, and she visualized getting her racing license to compete there one day too. That was until Groovy Hollow Speedway was rediscovered. That, over anywhere else, was where she wanted to make her late model stock debut. Chapter 2. Tommie had never heard of Groovy Hollow before, not before the rediscovery of the lost track. The track was rediscovered in the summer of 2021 to the surprise and perhaps disappointment of many of the community. The small town of Commonwealth became something of a spectacle then. Race fans within driving distance, and even a couple who weren't, made the trek to their tiny little corner of the map to look at the long-lost speedway. One of her favorite YouTubers, Slapshoes, even made a video about it. And being a resident of Commonwealth, she found a slight sense of pride in this new piqued interest for what was, only a few short weeks ago, a distinct track lost somewhere in the twilight zone of motorsports. Doug Richards, a descendant of the founding family of the Speedway, was the one who stumbled upon it. After spending much of Doug's early childhood in Commonwealth, the Richards family moved north to Bangor, Maine. They abandoned the track and turned their backs on the community of Commonwealth, just as the residents of Commonwealth had turned their backs on them. The last year of the Speedway's known existence was shrouded in controversy. For one thing, ticket sales dwindled, no matter how affordable Stephen Richards tried to make the prices, often risking his profit. A lot has been speculated as to why the Speedway withered up and died even before the tragedy that would eventually prompt the family to close its doors and shutter its windows. But they were linked strangely. Back in the 1990s, during the track's heyday, one driver dominated the Groovy Hollow Raceway unlike any other. As the story goes, he drove his iconically painted black, orange, and white late model to more than 10 track championships and was utterly unbeatable at his home track. His car, dubbed the Halloween Machine, was a dominant force to be reckoned with, and racing against it became somewhat of a novelty. Racers from all over the country, especially at the beginning of the driver's reign, signed up as a chance to take him down. But the problem with dominant drivers is that once there's a foregone conclusion that said driver was going to take the trophy, fans lose interest and start to leave in droves. For the Richards family, Bucky Blackwell, the infamous Halloween Machine's driver, was bad for business, and he just had to be stopped at any cost. Stephen Richards, in an act of dangerous desperation, would often put a bounty out on Blackwell, usually with thousands of dollars on the line, that would go to any driver who could beat him. Any amount in the thousands was huge for these small, struggling race teams. So needless to say, many hopefuls signed up on the entry list each weekend, thinking they were the ones to take down the undefeated Bucky Blackwell finally. With the additional dough on the line, the races turned mean. Overaggression became a massive problem at Groovy Hollow Raceway, totaling many cars and teams filing for bankruptcy, ultimately selling off their battered parts. But for Bucky, how badly his Halloween Machine was bruised and beaten didn't matter. He somehow always ended the race on top. And the next week he'd return, his car fully restored and looking brand spanking new. It wasn't fun anymore, a former Commonwealth resident had said in a local TV interview produced when the track was first rediscovered. The interviewer asked why he'd canceled his season tickets years before the track's last race was ever run. Well, when you know who's going to win, I don't know, it just sort of spoils the fun of it, doesn't it? I mean, Bucky was the king of that track and an undisputed king. He didn't have a David Pearson to his Richard Petty. There never were any challengers to him, and it just ruined it, especially for me. When the interviewer asked him if he'd be interested in signing up to be a season-long ticket holder again, he replied with a shrug and said, "Let's just see if they reopen it. I imagine there's a lot of work to do and many things to shift through. If they race, I might go to it. If they don't, that's fine too." The tragedy that ultimately closed the doors of the already struggling track happened on Halloween night in the year 2000. Bucky and his Halloween Machine started from the pole and had led every lap so far in the race. Stephen Richards and the other high-ups in the press box were told of a cell of weather moving closer to the track. Storms. Richard looked up at the scoreboard, seeing that 157 laps of a scheduled 200 had already been run. With just over 40 laps to go, Richards thought that they could get to the end of the event before the weather crashed over the speedway. "I ain't calling it," he reportedly had said, puffing on a fat cigar. To his protesters, he said, "Look, we're already in trouble here. We're on our last legs. If we call the race now, all these people in the stands, what are the odds they come back? Some of them might. Others, though, we've lost enough fans. I ain't doing nothing else to drive them even more off." So the race went on for about 12 more laps. By lap 169, drivers were complaining about a fine mist leaking out of the sky, coating their windshields. The moisture smeared with debris, making it increasingly difficult to see. The car slipped and slid through the turns. A few came close to spinning out. What happened next would be lodged into the memories of Stephen Richards until his dying day in 2013. A flash of blue lightning cut across the sandy black sky. He grabbed the microphone then, finally convinced to end the race prematurely. But before he could make the announcement or say anything at all, another bolt of lightning flashed across the sky, shooting down to the track. It struck the roof of Bucky Blackwell's fabled Halloween Machine, and the track was washed in a brilliant white light. Sparks rained down and the stadium lights winked out. Before anyone could fathom what the heck just happened, everyone at the track opened their eyes, coming out of a thick fog. Groovy Hollow Raceway was gone. Vanished, as was the Halloween Machine. The Richards family moved away after that, up north somewhere, by all reliable accounts, and they did their best to distance themselves from the haunting memory of the speedway. That was until the late 2010s when Doug Richards took to TikTok, rekindling the interest of fans for the lost track. Richards, in his short snippet of a video, declared that he was on a mission to locate the forgotten track at any cost and bring it back to its former glory. He spent several years camping out in the woods of the larger Appalachian area, praying for one day to find the answers he and his growing online followers so desired. It was in the early summer of 2021 when those prayers would finally be answered.
Thanks for listening, Groovy Gang. We'll be back with more Legend of Groovy Hollow in a moment. Alright, gang, we're back. Let's return now to the Legend of Groovy Hollow.
Chapter 3. The track seemed to have just turned up out of nowhere, as if there was a rip between what was real and what was a legend, and it just crawled out from that pit of non-existence, that darkness, from where all urban legends stem. As the story goes, Doug Richards was out at Emerson Diner in downtown Commonwealth when he just had an inkling, as he told and retold the story, embellishing a few key details here and there. After 3 long years of a lack of success in locating the long-lost racetrack, he just knew, as he was munching away at his quarter-pound burger and fistful of fries, that day, in particular, was going to be different. There was something in the air, as he described in one of his many interviews post-rediscovery. After chowing down, he decided that he was in the mood for a hike, and he knew the perfect trail along the Watauga River in northeast Tennessee. He hopped into his Jeep Ranger and drove to a nearby campground. He got out, made sure its canteen was sufficiently full, and went on his way, whistling an old bluegrass tune as he walked. As he inched ever closer to the long, dormant speedway, he said that he felt the presence of something, admitting that it was hard to describe. The closest thing he could compare it to was like resting at the bottom of Mount Everest and looking up, humbled in its looming shadow. He looked ahead, and through the trees he could see that something was out there, buried in the woods. Unknowingly, he picked up his pace and accelerated from a walk to a slight trot. Gravel crunched beneath the soles of his shoes, and dust kicked up into the air. As he got closer, the track became clearer. Through the shady trees and knotted woods, he saw the first rusted sightings of grandstands. Atop of them was a press box and huge lights. At long last, Groovy Hollow Raceway had been found. Doug quickly reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Hastily, he went to the TikTok app and went live. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have found it! Behold the myth and the legend! Groovy Hollow Raceway!" He turned his phone to better show off the ruined remains of the track. He said nothing more until the stream timed out. Then he put his phone away and took it all in himself for the first time. The track was a bare-bones facility consisting only of a single set of grandstands along the front stretch and a series of decrepit old houses spaced out on the property. There was a single concession stand on the outside. He stood there in awe, appreciating what he had discovered, while also thinking about the ramifications. Suddenly, he felt as if he was no longer alone, the speedway coming to life and creeping towards its own consciousness. It didn't take long for news to spread regarding the rediscovery of the fabled track. For the longest time, all Doug wanted was to find the track, a physical embodiment of his father's legacy and curse. Now that he had, he was asking himself, what's next? The logical conclusion of that was simple enough and right in front of him. Next, we race. But of course it wasn't that simple. The facility was in desperate need of a lot of work, a great undertaking that could take years to handle, if not decades. But even if Richards was able to assemble a crew to clean up the track and make it look more presentable, the odds that there would be enough interest from sponsors and even the residents of Commonwealth of seeing racing return there was slim to none. Tommie learned of the track's rediscovery from Dad, who poked his head in her room and asked if she had heard the news. "What news?" she asked him, just barely over the screams of Jamie Lee Curtis, the Scream Queen in the original Halloween movie. "They found it!" He was excited and not making much sense. Found what? She asked. I can't believe they found it. Dad was out of breath, heaving. It took him a few minutes and a glass of water to get him to calm down enough to tell her the gist. There was this racetrack when I was a kid, here, just outside of Commonwealth. Originally, they called it the Commonwealth International Speedway, but the more common name for it was Groovy Hollow Raceway. Groovy Hollow? Tommie asked and gnawed on the name a moment. It sounded a little hippy-dippy to her, but she dug it nonetheless. How did it get that name? Because of the Halloween machine and its driver, Bucky Blackwell. His car was groovy, all right. Painted in a slick black and orange scheme, it was spooky fast, too. He practically owned the late model scene at the track, dominating it for nearly a decade. He won everything. I think Groovy Hollow was the only track he ever raced at, and he beat everybody there. Even some future stars who made it to NASCAR. You probably don't remember John Rex, do you? Tommie shook her head. Well, he was a driver from around here, built in Kingsport. He never made it big in terms of being like a cup driver. Never made any Xfinity starts either, I don't believe. But he did run a handful of truck races. He never attempted a full season. Never could secure sponsorship, I don't think. But he was serviceable in the NASCAR Truck Series. He even scored a win in the season-opening race at Daytona. That was, almost 10 years ago? Maybe a little more. He was driving the number 7 truck for Red Steed Racing. Dad sat and squinted with a thin smile on his lips. Anyway, him being from the area, he came over here one year to compete before the track. Well, he swallowed hard. Disappeared. He ran pretty well, too. I think he ran maybe second, but he was no match for Bucky. Nobody ever was. Like I said, he owned that track, and the winner's circle may as well have been an extension of himself. Heck, the same could be said about the whole darn track, I think. Rex came in second, 2 laps off the pace behind Blackwell and his blasted Halloween machine. Really? He lapped the whole field twice? Tommie asked. Dad nodded. Yeah, sure did. He really stunk up the show around here for a while there. He wasn't the only one, though. Terry Lane tried his hand at it, too. Even he finished second to Bucky, a lap off the pace. Terry Lane? Where do I know that name? The announcer? Making me feel old, kiddo, Dad said. Yeah, but before he was an announcer, he was a driver. A Daytona 500 winning driver at that. He won another race, too, I think. Both were coming from Daytona, of course. But while Rex and Lane never became a couple of the all-time greats in NASCAR history, they still made it up there to some of the most elite levels in motorsports. That's more than what a whole lot of local racers around here do, you know? And Blackwell beat him up on both of them. If he was so good, why haven't I heard of him? You talk about him like he's, I don't know, some sort of legend or something. Why isn't he talked about? What'd he do? Dad's smile faded then. A gleaming, dreamlike twinkle in his eyes. He said, That's a loaded question, hun. There are stories about him and his past. I think you used the word legend. Yeah, he was a legend of sorts, all right. Maybe for the wrong reasons. But all that's just hearsay. I'll tell you if you want to hear it, but you'll have to take it with a grain of salt. Then, of course, there's what happened. And I have my own opinions about him and why he never blew up into superstardom. You know, based on the stories I've heard. Tommie inched closer to the edge of her seat. Tell me. I love a good story, as long as it's spooky. Tommie had always been a sucker for a good ghost story. Dad nodded. I'll start with my opinion first. I think Bucky Blackwell never made it up to the ranks and into NASCAR because he didn't want to go. That's crazy talk. What racer worth their salt doesn't want to be a NASCAR driver someday? That's just unfathomable, Tommie said. Yeah, Dad nodded. Well, not everyone thinks that way, Tommie. Some people, particularly working people, race cars just for the fun of it. And if they're good at it, they make a little extra money for the week so that things won't be so tight at home. They treat it as more of a hobby or a side gig than anything super serious. And this Bucky Blackwell guy, he was like that? A family man racing for a hobby? Dad shook his head. No, he was no family man. He did enjoy racing, I think, but not nearly as much as he loved winning. And he loved winning almost as much as he hated losing. He was a menace on the track. Off the track, he mostly kept to himself, at least in racing and even communal circles. Nobody knew that much about him, really. And that's when speculation starts to creep in. He was mysterious, Tommie. Eerily mysterious. But the reason I don't think he ever attempted to climb up the NASCAR ladder stems from that selfishness. Beating the snot out of the local talent was fun to him. That was his real passion. He maybe even loved it. But once you start ascending up the ranks, inevitably, you're going to get beat, and I don't think he could stand the thought of that. I think he was more than satisfied with what he was and what he was doing. In truth, Tommie could understand that. Nobody likes to lose, in her opinion. The people who say that the fun of a game is just playing, no matter the outcome, are either lying or complete lunatics. There were other reasons, of course. A lot of people at the time thought that he had his hands in some shady dealings. All that turned out to be true, and it became public knowledge after the disappearance. Disappearance? Tommie asked her dad. The word seemed strange somehow, utterly alien, and she couldn't get a firm grasp on it. The implications of that strange word seemed too far out, spreading away in distant space. Dad nodded his head. Yeah, well, this is where the story starts to become a little, I don't know, spooky. This is when it turns into a campfire story passed down through the generations. Dad got a smile on his face and his eyes sank. He was thinking of happier times. The good old days, he liked to call them. But Tommie would be lying if she said that she didn't sometimes wonder if those long-gone days were actually better, or if Dad and so many others were just looking back through a film of rose-colored lenses. I guess I can continue and pass the story on to you. Dad told her the story of Bucky Blackwell and what happened to him in the infamously mysterious Groovy Hollow Raceway. And it was a wild story for sure, hardly plausible. But Tommie did as she was told. She didn't interrupt and let her dad spin his yarn. When the story was finished, Dad was silent for a moment. His posture kind of relaxed, and that dreamy look fogged his eyes again. But this time he wasn't smiling. It was like he was remembering those self-proclaimed good old days. But the rose-colored glasses had slipped from his face and fell onto the floor. "Dad?" Tommie said, and Dad snapped back into himself. The smile reappeared on his face. "Is that story really true?" Dad shrugged. "I don't know. I think parts of it are true or have some truth to them. Who can say whether or not it's completely historically accurate? Nobody around here, that's for sure. Maybe the only person who knows the complete truth is Bucky Blackwell himself. And he ain't here, is he?" "I guess not," Tommie agreed. And a short film played in her mind. She could envision the fabled Halloween machine sliding into the tight corners of Groovy Hollow Raceway, the flash of lightning striking the rooftop number, and all the brilliant colors that would come with such an inexplicable explosion. Then the film strip ran out. The screen went black as the surrounding Commonwealth woods in the heart of night, where not even the light of the moon can reach. Chapter 4. Dad had heard through the grapevine, most likely on the Facebook social media app that people of his generation tend to use, of an effort being put together to clean up around the Groovy Hollow Raceway that had been rediscovered, or maybe mysteriously reappeared, in an attempt to have the racing return to the area. He asked Tommie if she wanted to be involved, and of course she eagerly agreed. Still not knowing how straight to take her father's tale of Bucky Blackwell and the disappearance of the track, she was excited to see the location where the whole ordeal allegedly took place. She put on her favorite pair of jeans, the white pair of cowboy boots her mom bought from the country western store over in Pigeon Forge, and tied her hair up in a ponytail. She knew it was going to be a dirty job. She went down the stairs to meet her dad, who was already at the door waiting for her. Dressed in his typical flannel jeans and a trucker hat he had won from an online contest reading "Out of the Groove" on it. He smelled strongly of Old Spice deodorant and aftershave. He had already packed a cooler he lugged around on his back as they hiked through the woods. Inside it was 5 24-ounce bottles of Mountain Dew and 3 waters. Tommie looked at him and flashed him a raised eyebrow look that said, "Really?" And Dad knew what it meant. She had him well trained. With a sigh that seemed to beg the question, "What are you, my mom?" He let the backpack cooler fall from his shoulders and he headed back for the kitchen. When he returned a couple of minutes later, Tommie inspected the bag again. He had put back 3 of the Mountain Dews and put in an additional 4 waters. She could live with that compromise. "Let's go," she said, and let him out of the door. She took a brief glimpse at the late model stock sitting in the garage, and her heart fluttered. It was still very much a fixer-upper, but in time she and her dad would get it rolling again. Maybe even sometime soon. She blew the car a kiss and gave it a wink. Dad rolled his eyes but couldn't help but laugh. She didn't care. She was going to be a racer someday, and she was going to drive that late model car on track at Groovy Hollow Raceway. She just knew it, and today was the first step in that journey. They got into the truck and Dad backed them out of the driveway. It didn't take them long to reach the woods, and they pulled in behind a growing line of cars and pickup trucks. Dad put the truck into park and shut off the engine. "Are you ready for this?" But by the time he asked, Tommie was already getting out of the truck and slinging the heavy backpack cooler on her shoulders. She could handle it. "Come on," she said, "let's go." And she slammed the door shut. Dad couldn't fight that kind of enthusiasm, so he followed behind her quickly. There was a gathering of people, mostly men and their sons, pooling on the shoulder of the dirt road. Tommie and Dad joined them. They mingled for a while, reminiscing about older races and how things had changed for the worse. They talked about NASCAR mostly and touched a little bit on the local short track scene, which Tommie knew even then was dwindling. But nobody mentioned Bucky Blackwell, his devilish car, or his reign of terror. No one would dare, and she certainly wasn't about to bring it up. She figured that it only put a damper on things. When it seemed that everyone had run out of things to say, someone took charge. "All right, everybody, thanks for coming out today. My name is Eddie. I started the Facebook page that brought you all here. I've been a NASCAR fan almost my entire life. I root for Kyle Busch mostly, which I know isn't very popular, but I also just generally love the sport. And there would be no NASCAR if there weren't local short tracks like Greenville Pickens, Florence, and Groovy Hollow Raceway. Young drivers need places like this to cut their teeth, learn, and develop. My hope, as well as the hope of Mr. Richards," Eddie paused a moment and gestured to another man in the crowd standing next to him, "is to someday reopen Groovy Hollow Raceway and host some local short track events throughout the racing season." Eddie spoke with the sort of confidence that Tommie admired. He was the leader, a take-charge type, and Tommie had no problem following him. And the road to that dream and that goal starts today and with all of you. If we can make that track look presentable, maybe we can attract some sponsors, which is just the shot in the arm this track and this community needs. Some murmurs broke out into the crowd, mostly nonsensical static. The kind of sound that comes through an old-timey radio when the knob is turned between 2 different stations. Somewhere from behind Tommie, she couldn't see his face. Someone asked, rather sheepishly, just over a whisper, about Bucky Blackwell and his strange disappearance. Tommie's first inclination was that he was a reporter of sorts. The whispers amongst the crowd ceased all at once. Collectively, they turned to face him. What they saw was a lanky, tow-headed young man with rat-like features. There was a cigarette tucked in behind his ear. Over his shoulder hung a camera on a strap, and in his hands were a notepad and a mechanical pencil. Definitely a reporter. And his questions seemed to chill everyone in the crowd, even herself. Eddie cleared his throat. "Yes, we are aware of the stories and the legends. Whether or not they are true is not really our concern. It's in the past, and what's past is past. We're looking to the future, and we think that this little bullring of a track could attract quite a crowd if it were ever to be resurrected." Resurrected? Tommie didn't like that word. Momentarily, flashes of scenes from the Universal Pictures adaptation of Frankenstein appeared before her very eyes. She loved that movie in her heart of hearts, but the book was better. That was almost always the case. The book was always superior. But she thought of the story and for a moment saw the track as the dreaded monster conjured up by a postmodern Prometheus. But she shook the thought away. It was ridiculous, really, and she turned her back to the reporter. "Do you think it's haunted?" the reporter asked, a ridiculous notion. Eddie stumbled a moment, hesitant, but ultimately didn't take the bait. "Can I ask who you write for? I noticed the pad and pencil. Are you with the press or the Herald Courier?" Nah, I'm with a small independent publication, the Nowhere Chronicles. That told Tommie all she needed to know about the man. She had seen copies of the Nowhere Chronicles sitting undisturbed on wire racks at dollar stores and gas stations, usually beside a copy of USA Today. The covers were bright and attention-grabbing, but for all the wrong reasons. It was a tabloid consisting of stories adapted from various local legends, an underground TMZ for all things strange and bizarre. Those kinds of mags were fun to read at times, but they were not to be taken seriously. Though, given the legend around Groovy Hollow Raceway, Tommie had to admit that it seemed like the kind of thing that would be written up about in that sort of lowbrow publication. Eddie must have known the publication as well. He let out something of a scoff, which tapered off into an airy chuckle. He smiled. Right, well, I have no further comment, Mr. Jones. Howard Jones. Right, well, Mr. Jones, I nor the people here today, volunteers, mind you, have any further comments for your story. He stressed the word story. Go write it, do what you do, and we'll do what we do, okay? And with that, Eddie turned and pumped a fist into the air. This way to the track, he said. And with Doug Richards by his side, they led Tommie, Dad, and all the other volunteers through the woods to the racetrack. She felt like she was part of the tour group and Charlie in the chocolate factory. Chapter 5. When Tommie saw the condition of the track, she felt a sinking sensation in the pit of her stomach. A sense of helplessness flooded her, and she just knew that they were never going to get that track up and running. It appeared, at first glance, way too far gone. A lost cause, maybe, and she could easily see some land developer presenting Doug Richards with an offer he just couldn't refuse, tempting him to sell it once and for all. The land developer would almost certainly tear the track down, clear out the area completely, and put like a Walmart or shopping mall in its place. Or maybe a whole shopping center with stores like Old Navy, Gap, and Bass Pro Shops, not to mention a slew of new booming restaurants. If that ever happened, the legend of Groovy Hollow would die forever, buried in everything. But that was why they were there, right? To straighten it up and make it look usable? But Tommie didn't know if that was possible, and looking at the condemned wreckage now, it all just seemed to be too much. It was overwhelming. She wondered if she was alone in her suffocating doubt. Maybe she was, maybe she wasn't. However, one thing that was certain was that when it came to most of the volunteers who showed up to lend out their time, there was a sense of hope. Collectively, they all just stood and stared at the abandoned speedway for several minutes. And if Tommie wasn't completely insane, she thought a couple of the men, the ones who appeared to be the most burly, with the curly beards covering the lower half of their faces, were starting to tear up. She heard sniffling sounds followed by a series of long, exaggerated exhales, and what sounded like them wiping their dripping noses on the sleeves of their shirts. Tommie didn't look at them, didn't want to acknowledge it. She only looked up at her dad, who met her eyes. He smiled slightly, and his eyes, dilated as they were, possessed some form of spark. Though she had never seen her father as looking ancient, he was no spring chicken either. She knew that, and as she became older herself, started to notice it more and more. But at that moment, he de-aged somehow, looking closer to a little boy on Christmas morning, excited to unwrap his presents, rather than the jaded, hungover father nursing the wounds from his good time the night before with a big mug of steamy hot black coffee. His eyes said one thing, and the message was clear. Let's do this. They got to work, starting with clearing out the surrounding brush on the outside of the track and collecting it all in one massive pile where the remnants of the gravel and dirt parking lot bordered the grass field. But it didn't take long for them to grow bored with the outside work. They stopped, vowing to clear the field out another time when it was much more appropriate to do so. They all really wanted to go inside the track to see how it held up after all these years. Eddie led the volunteers to the front gate. It was just a simple chain-link fence with a small wooden shack that had once been white but was now faded and splintery. Atop the track was a sign reading tickets. The gate was clasped shut, held that way by a rope of chains and an oversized padlock. Eddie reached up and grabbed at the chain-link fence. The whole thing, red with rust, seemed to sway like it might all come down, but it didn't. The gate rattled against the chain, and Eddie looked at Doug Richards and asked, Do you have a key? Doug shook his head. No, Dad never gave it to me anyway. When he died, there was a bunch of keys locked away in his safe. I didn't know what they were for or what they went to. But they're at the house now, probably lost in a junk drawer somewhere, I don't know. I bet one of them went to this. He shrugged. We don't need 'em. Doug let the oversized backpack embracing his shoulders fall. It was the first time Tommie noticed just how cartoonishly large it was. He sat on the ground with a clank and unzipped it with one hand while fishing out bottled water from the mesh side pocket with the other. He paused, took a long drink, and returned the bottle to the pocket as he pulled out a big pair of bolt cutters. Eddie moved aside and Doug proceeded to cut the chains, which took a couple of labored attempts. But Tommie knew he was successful when she heard the sound of the rusty chains rattle down the face of the fence and coil onto the ground. It was the most satisfying sound she could ever think to hear at that moment. Doug and Eddie each grabbed a side of the gate and pulled it towards them, opening it. The aged metal groaned against each other, and Eddie said, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the famous Groovy Hollow Raceway." He and Doug led them inside. They walked off to the right near where Tommie believed was supposed to be turn 1. There was a break in the wall there, as in the corners there was no pit wall, only a small hill of sand trailing down from the lightly banked asphalt. "We'll have to put in an outside wall," Doug said, and Eddie nodded as if it had already been decided that they were doing this, and that Groovy Hollow would once again be hosting local short-track racing in the not-too-distant future. While Tommie had her doubts, this made her heart flutter with optimism, and she could see herself one day wheeling that number 28 late-model stock her father had bought her around the track's sweeping turns, fighting loose conditions. It sounded like a whole lot of fun. Tommie looked back at the grandstands. They would have to be replaced, too. The metal foundation was rusted and crooked-leaning, and the wooden seats and steps rotted and busted. She looked up at the press box. Groovy Hollow was painted on it in thick black paint, the former Mr. Richards embracing the track's Halloween aesthetic. The plexiglass windows of the press box were smeared with brown dust and dirt. Boar bees were flying in and out of it in neat, organized lines. She was sure that somewhere up there was a nest of hornets or some other kind of wasp. Tommie didn't have many fears, but bees, and particularly wasps, were her biggest ones. Tommie grimaced and shivered, gnawing at her bottom lip. Then her eyes were drawn back to the plexiglass windows of the press box. There was someone in there, she thought, as she perfectly made out a darkened silhouette in the unmistakable shape of a man. She reached out to tug at her father's sleeve to gain his attention, just like she had when she was a little girl, but he was too far out of reach. The shadow took a step back and was gone, engulfed by further darkness. The asphalt of the track itself was remarkably clean. There were a few cracks here and there with a minimal amount of weeds sprouting from them, and the surface was very worn. It would be hard to handle for sure, but all in all it looked completely raceable. The infield was a little worse for wear. The roof of the infield garage was caving in on itself, and Victory Lane, which rose from the infield like a stage, was dirty, the concrete arch overseeing the entrance of it collapsing into gravelly rubble. "We can take care of these weeds," Doug said, looking at Eddie. "I got a weed eater out in the truck. Be right back." And then he was off, slipping back out through the gate and sprouting out into the woods. Dad grabbed a couple of trash bags and handed Tommie one. "Here," he said, "let's start getting this trash up." And they did. They started on the front stretch and worked their way down into turn 1. Dad whistled a tune that was familiar to Tommie, but she couldn't tell where she had heard it from. Maybe it was something Dad whistled into her crib when she was a baby, or by rocking her to sleep when she was a young child. Whatever the case, the tune was melodic and lovely, and it warmed her heart. Doug returned about 15 minutes later with the weed eater. He was heaving, out of breath from lugging the heavy cobalt through the twisting woods. He and Eddie took turns trimming the weeds through the open wounds on the track's surface. Tommie, Dad, and other fathers and kids picked up trash, and some of the men moved different parts of debris away into clusters by the outside retaining wall to be dealt with later. Most of the stuff Tommie found she threw away. Losing lottery tickets, weather-battered paper cups, plastic nacho trays from the concession stands. She did, however, keep a few things as souvenirs. There was a chip from the outside wall that was mostly intact. She shoved it into her bag. And there was an old ticket stub. The writing was hardly legible. only the word hollow appearing at the top in a faded holographic image. She could also make out the seats. It said row 3, seat 13. She shoved that into the back as well, and they carried on. By the time they'd cleaned up half the track, the sun was starting to dip below the trees, and the sky was a deep, burning orange. It was time to call it a night. Chapter 6. The next weekend, they went back to the track. They did some more work, clearing out more of the trash and weeds from the backstretch down into turns 3 and 4. By and large, the racing surface looked better, but the facility seemed worse somehow, as if they were in advanced stages of decay and rotting at an accelerated rate. On the third weekend, the group from Facebook met for a final time, but they didn't do much work other than tinker here and there, surveying what all needed to be done. The men drank beers except for Dad. He didn't drink anymore, but he sipped a long-necked glass of bottled Mountain Dew he brought from a Roadrunner convenience store down the road. They were more expensive, but Dad always said that they were the best on the account that they're made with real cane sugar instead of high-fructose corn syrup. Tommy thought they were just bad for him all around, but didn't say anything. He had earned it with how hard he'd worked, so she figured she set her nagging aside. Besides, the retro look of the glass bottle looked kind of cool. It was like the paint scheme Tommy had seen online from Darrell Waltrip back in the 80s driving the number 11 car for the now extinct Junior Johnson Associates team. Dale Jr. had done a throwback to that car on 2 separate occasions, and she almost asked Dad if she could have the bottle when he was done. It'd make a great accessory to her racing memorabilia collection. After the third weekend, the Facebook group disbanded. The track was closed to the public, supposedly surveyed by local law enforcement on the hunt for trespassers when there was nothing to do on a quiet Sunday morning. Everything from the track went radio silent. This concerned Tommy as her fears that Doug Richards had been approached by some suave businessman in a suit to buy the property out from under them. Out from under Commonwealth came creeping back. She asked her dad about it a couple of times, and he shrugged the notion off. But he didn't know. He couldn't have known, not really, what exactly was up Doug Richards' wealthy cufflink sleeves. Some men, especially those with an abundance of wealth, will say just about anything to get what they want, no matter the people or communities they hurt in the process. It sure would stink if their efforts in shaping the track up were just a pawn in some real estate developing scheme. The murmurs didn't begin until the beginning of August. July had been a miserably hot month, and Tommy was looking forward to the weather cooling off a bit despite the fact that she was dreading the return of school, which had taken far too many valuable hours in real estate in her life. It was the night just before school was fixing to start up again. Tommy was in her room making sure a book bag and all its accessories were working and ready to go. Next was to lay out her clothes so she wouldn't have to do so in the morning. She got up off her bed and started to walk towards her closet when she heard a couple of knocks on her bedroom door. She paused and turned. "Come in," she said, slightly annoyed by the fact that her father was interrupting her prep. He poked his head in. "Do you have a minute?" He smiled, almost giddy. Sure, I guess," Tommy said. She walked back into her bed and fell down onto it hard, riding the waves of the croaking springs. "What's up?" Dad opened the door a little wider and came in. He was holding his laptop, a big-screened HP he often used for work, and brought it over to her. His finger was on the mouse pad, and white light from the screen illuminated his glasses. His smile seemed even wider then, almost insane. He scrolled through a page, Tommy noticing the small, illegible text zooming by in the reflection of his specs. Then he stopped, finding whatever he was looking for. He turned the screen to face her and said, "Look." The website was Facebook, and what she was looking at was a newish post. It was created on July 15th, called Groovy Hollow Raceway. Under it, in the info box, read, "The historic .03756-mile short track is back. Announcement pending. Fall 2021. Tommy looked up at her dad, who grinned wide as he could. "Uh-huh," she said, feeling hopeful but also realistic. Tommy knew that Facebook was prone to fake accounts and scams galore. "You really think this is the real deal?" Her brow furrowed. Dad's smile faltered. "Of course I do. Why wouldn't I?" "Dad, you get friend requests from bots using attractive women as their avatars all the time. They basically litter your notifications with comments from posts you made 2 years ago. And they clutter up your inbox. How do you know that this is not something similar?" Dad's smile fully fell away then. He turned his computer back to him, squinted his eyes, and looked hard at the Facebook page. I don't think it's that. No, look, there's even a phone number and email link in the info box, see? He turned the computer back to her. Maybe I'll call them tomorrow. See if it's on the up and up, you know? Tommie did know, and she hoped with all her heart that her reservations were misguided. Yeah, that's probably a good idea, and if it's legit, we have a speedway that's all our own, even closer than Bristol. Yeah, and we can get like season tickets or something, Dad exclaimed. Sounds like a blast, Tommie said. Dad shut his laptop and ruffled Tommie's head like he used to back when she was little. Then he was out of the room and down the hall, most likely to do more research about the speedway and its potential grand reopening, only to find nothing official. In fact, all he was able to find, other than the possibly phantom Facebook page, was a Reddit thread with a question about the page and a response from someone within the Commonwealth community, expressing how badly they wish for the page to be a scam. The track has been gone forever, the post read. Commonwealth has moved on from racing, and I'm not going to abide by this town. My town being bombarded with noisy, obnoxious racecar drivers and drunken race fans. The official announcement came on that Friday of the next week. A short video was posted to the apparently legitimate Facebook page of Doug and Eddie announcing the grand revival of the Groovy Hollow Raceway. The plan initially was to run a single late-model stock car race on Wednesday, October 27, 2021 at 7 p.m. A limited number of tickets were set up to go on sale on the coming Monday, the proceeds of which would be donated to charity. Any future race was pending on the success and fan interest of the first, making it a make-or-break event. Sponsoring the event was the likes of Toxic Waste Hazardly Sour Candy, which was to be presented by a company called Groovy Media. Dad brought the laptop to Tommie to show her the video. He was shaking so badly of excitement that she had trouble seeing if the men on screen were indeed Doug and Eddie. It's real, Dad exclaimed happily. Tommie smiled. So it seems. She stood up and crossed her bedroom to peer out at the night sky. The moon was full that night, and the clouds scattered across the sky and moved slowly. Should I buy tickets? I bet they'll go fast, Dad said. Tommie told him that he should, and Dad set a reminder on his phone for 8 o'clock Monday morning to prompt him to do so. Looking out her window and down at the car Dad had bought her for her sweet 16, that was the moment when she knew, just knew, that one day when she was ready, she was going to race that number 28 beauty at the infamous Groovy Hollow Raceway. Chapter 7. There were bumps along the way in hosting the first Groovy Hollow race in over a decade. For starters, an opposition group was formed. They created pages on both Facebook and X called Vote No to Hollow, their avatars being the picture of the track outline with a red circle and diagonal slash drawn through it. To the best of Tommie's knowledge, the whole effort was spearheaded by a shrewd woman named Carol. At the very least, she was the one who fought the hardest against the reopening of the speedway, attending several Commonwealth Town Council meetings to drum up support for her futile cause, until they just couldn't ignore her anymore. A hearing was scheduled at the end of August. The city council advised Doug and Eddie to suspend their efforts at least until a final decision was made. They ignored this advice as they continued to promote the Groovy Hollow 300, while drumming up some support of their own. Tommie watched the hearing, which was streamed live on Facebook. Doug plugged his laptop into the TV and they settled in, eagerly waiting for the results. Tommie nervously gnawed at her fingernails, biting them down painfully into the quick. This was the first time she had seen Carol in the flesh. She was a rat-faced woman with her pointed nose high in the air, acting as if her crap didn't stink. Her hair was brown, but she was old enough, and based on the deep wrinkles on her face and crow's feet carved into the corners of her eyes, Tommie was almost certain that her hair color was the product of something out of a bottle. In her primary argument, the woman said, "Listen, we have to be practical about this. We have to think about the children." In Tommie's opinion, the first sign that someone is losing an argument is when they ask you, without much more substance, to think of the children. To reopen the speedway would disrupt their way of life. Bus routes would have to change. Traffic would be more clustered, and the strangers. Nothing but a bunch of drunks coming in and out of town like a revolving door. I don't want that for my kids, and if you were a good parent, neither should you, she went on to say. I understand that once upon a time, the track was vital to this community. It was! To deny it would be foolish of me. Tommie could agree with her there, though she seemed largely foolish overall. But the track closed. A community grew in Commonwealth. A community that wasn't and will never be race fans. Groovy Hollow Raceway is a piece of Commonwealth history, but that's just it. It's all just history, and we need to move forward and not be so focused on what's in our rear-view mirror. There are lots of other tracks in the area where the local racers can race. There's Kingsport, Bristol. Heck, there's even one in North Carolina that ain't too far of a drive. Why disrupt an entire community who doesn't care about racing just to satisfy the few? She went on. I'm not saying that you, Mr. Richard, should close the track entirely. I think it would be a great place to host some concerts and other events of that nature. But racing is dead in Commonwealth and has been for a very long time. I ask the panel today to please veto this option to reopen Groovy Hollow Raceway as the racing facility. Thank you. What a total quack, Dad exclaimed. He tossed a couple of popcorn kernels in his mouth, chewed them, and swallowed. That lady doesn't know what the heck she's talking about. And that hair, Tommie said. That's a Karen haircut if I've ever seen one. They both laughed at this until the hearing went into recess. Then she looked at her dad and asked, Do you think they'll really do it? Reopen, I mean, or do you think that woman will win? Dad shrugged. I don't know. I'd like to think they reopen it. Clearly, that woman doesn't know what she's talking about. She's crazy and unhinged. But that doesn't mean the council won't go for it. It all comes down to money, Tommie. Whoever has the most financial backing in their corner usually wins. That's why the world is as messed up as it is. He paused a moment to munch on some popcorn and take an audibly satisfying swig of his Mountain Dew. With the bottle cracking in his hand, he said, But I have hope, Tommie. I have hope that one day Groovy Hollow will reopen and they'll be racing there once again. He turned to look at her. And hey, who knows? Maybe with Mabel out there, you'll even turn some laps there yourself. He winked at her. In the end, the council ruled in favor of the Groovy Hollow representatives, and the prepping for race week carried on. The Vote No to Hollow campaign appealed but did not prevail. Shortly thereafter, they disbanded, citing differences in strategy as the key component. From that, several groups formed, none of which made much noise. Dad secured Tommie's and his tickets, and before they knew it, it was October 27th, race day.
We hope you enjoyed the first episode of The Legend of Groovy Hollow. Check out the next episode to find out what happens when Groovy Hollow Raceway once again comes alive. The Legend of Groovy Hollow is a novel written by Cody Williams and performed by Jillian Cool. Groovy Hollow is a production of Out of the Groove, The Daily Downforce, and AE Engine. For more great content like this, visit dailydownforce.com.